We have to be innovative to find the best way forward. Perhaps we can look at this as crowdsourcing from local experts that may or may not have ever been asked to share their opinion previously. If we're focused on only raising revenue, we may end up doing more damage by fixing things in the wrong order and costing Alaskans even more. We know this, though, inaction is not an option. We need help from those of you in the field and in this business to ensure that we're going in the right direction. We need buy-in from Alaskans. This is a worthwhile investment and in the correct order of phasing. Alaskans have been burned before, and at this moment seem to have little appetite for giant price tags, costly mistakes, and more bad news about the Port of Alaska. The upside of this is that many more people now know the importance of the port for the transportation of goods and the movement of military supplies because of this conversation and also because of the earthquake of November 30th, 2018. So I'm speaking for myself, but I believe it's shared that we are here to take the opportunity to ensure that we do the right thing. So I'm looking forward to an open dialogue and exchange of ideas. And some members had asked to have this as kind of a panel discussion, so we set up a panel, but it looks like no one's really wanting to join the panel up at the front, and I'm not one who wants to compel people to be where they don't want to be. And so the order of operations will be CH2 or Jacobs will come up and do a pretty in-depth presentation on what has been proposed. And this is information gathering for us and also an opportunity for you to hear from the contractor of record what's going on. So I'd like to invite CH2 Jacobs to come up. And please state your name for the record.
Jeff Bull, B-O-O-L, CH2M. Go ahead. Thanks. This is an important conversation for everybody in the municipality, and I think starting at the highest level, one of the questions we get asked is the Port of Alaska the right location to modernize? Modernization is not a discretionary issue. The current Port of Alaska facilities are badly corroded, have exceeded their design life. There's a number of options that are available to us, Port of Seward, Whittier, Valdez, so on, or a combination of those ports should be considered for a solution. Past benefit cost analysis that has been performed on the program has indicated that the Port of Alaska is the best location for considering all the factors. But part of this process, I think that we need to circle around once we think we've got the best solution for the Port of Alaska is back check, is this the right location for the municipality? Next slide. The current program, the Port of Alaska Modernization Program, picked up where the Port Intermodal Expansion Program left off. From the graph, you can see on the left-hand side the North Extension area that was built up with the previous program, and on the right-hand side is what's called the South Backlands, which is fill that was placed from the previous program. In 2012, the previous program was suspended. The Corps of Engineers did a suitability study in 2013 to determine whether anything could be salvaged. It was overwhelmingly considered that the areas were globally unstable, the north end, but the south end could be salvaged as is. So 2014, the Port of Alaska Modernization Program was established to take on developing a new concept and moving forward. It's a programmatic approach as opposed to an individual project approach because coordination between all the port operations, between the projects, requires somebody to look at the overall picture, not just one project individually. So it's a programmatic approach to the solution. Next slide. In 2014, there was a design charrette. All the primary stakeholders, or most of them, were represented. Municipality of Anchorage representatives, including the Geotechnical Advisory Committee, the port, TOTE, Horizon, which is now Matson, ABI, Southwest Pilots Association, Corps of Engineers, the Alaska Railroad, and our team. Next slide. The charrette goals were pretty rudimentary when we started, replacing terminals 2 and 3, which is Matson and TOTE's terminals, minimizing investment in the North Extension, provide new, modern, safe, efficient port facilities, which is a pretty broad goal. Focus on existing business. In other words, no expansion, just replace what's already in use. And provide flexibility for future growth to support larger vessels and allow a deeper draft. The outcome of the charrette was the program design requirements, the Charrette Structural Approach, and the Concept D, layout and phasing. There was 4 concepts reviewed. They encompassed different phasing of the work, and Concept D was the one that was chosen. Next slide. This is not an exhaustive list, but this gives you an idea of the types of design criteria and requirements that were developed from the charrette. It was established that the facilities would have a 75-year design life. The Petroleum and Cement Terminal and Terminal 2 would meet the highest seismic criteria since they're designated critical facilities. And what that means is they have to meet minimal damage. They have to be able to be back up in service within 7 days after a design-level event. All the other facilities meet the lowest seismic criteria, which is life safety. There was a number of tenant operational requirements from ABI, Matson, and Tote. Lots of phasing details came from the pilots and the tug operators. One of the goals was maximizing land retention of the North Extension, which the port leases and generates revenue from that, and the increased dredge depth, going from a current minus 35 to a future minus 45 dredge depth. Next slide. The Charrette Structural Approach centered around a conventional steel pile-supported wharf and trestle. The bulkhead systems were discounted primarily because of problems from the previous program with bulkhead failure, and in the consideration of the geotechnical conditions, heavy loads created by retained fill over the underlying marine silts and bootlegger cove clay are susceptible to liquefaction and global instability. Piles driven deep into the inlet below the bootlegger cove clay provides a lightweight, stable foundation for the facilities. Hollow concrete piles were considered to try to eliminate steel piling because we're here because the steel piles have corroded. So we looked at concrete piles as an alternative. They were not able to provide the necessary stiffness for the seismic loads. So we're using steel piling as the basis. And the wharf face for Terminals 1 and 2 was moved out 140 feet from the shore into deeper, faster water to align with the North Extension Stabilization and to reduce sedimentation and dredging requirements. So those were kind of the fundamental approach to a structural solution that meets the needs. Next slide. This is the Concept D phasing plan. This is actually Rev 7 of the phasing plan, but it's essentially what came out of the charrette in 2014. Phase 1, you can see in the upper panel, stabilizing the PIEP South Backlands, which is armoring the slope and protecting that from erosion. You can't see on the graphic very well. Upper right-hand side there. The Petroleum and Cement Terminal will be the first new terminal to be built in a new location south of the existing port. And what that allows us to do is move from an existing terminal, move into the Petroleum and Cement Terminal, and demolish the existing terminal and start hopscotching our way from south up to the north end. And because of this Petroleum and Cement Terminal is a new location, it's required a significant amount of transitional dredging, which is dredging out the existing tidal silts in an area that was not previously maintained by the Corps of Engineers. Phase 2 starts with the NES1 cutback, which is the south half of the Northern Extension Stabilization Project. That is required because during Phase 2, when we start building out Terminal 1 and 2, we create a slot for Matson and Tote to get up to their berth, and they need some room to navigate up to the berth. So we have to cut back half that north extension for them to be able to navigate in there while we're constructing the new Terminals 1 and 2. The rest of the Phase 2 is a Landside Buildings project to relocate the port administration functions from the building that's currently on Terminal 1 into a new administration building on port property. And then, of course, the construction of Terminals 1 and 2, which is 2 projects over 5 years in 4 specific stages, moving Matson and Tote back, moving one ahead, hopscotching our way up and configuring around their vessels and their operational requirements. Phase 3 is the Petroleum and Cement Terminal, which essentially fills the gap between the Petroleum and Cement Terminal and Terminal 1 to bring out the wharf line to be a continuous wharf. And then phases 4 and 5 are demolition of the remaining part of the North Extension and demolition of Terminal 3. Okay, next slide. Phase 1 is 13% of the total program cost, and it includes, we talked about South Backlands Stabilization, the South Floating Dock Relocation, Transitional Dredging, and the Petroleum and Cement Terminal. Next slide. We have 3 fixed price contracts in place for 2019 construction for Phase 1, which is the South Backlands Stabilization, the Transitional Dredging, and the South Floating Dock Relocation. So that work is scheduled to be completed this summer. Next slide. The Petroleum and Cement Terminal design will be completed March 15th, so we're almost 100% complete with the design of that facility. We are planning on the current plan to procure all of the 48-inch diameter piles which support the access trestle and the platform. There's 71 48-inch piles, estimated value of $17 million. We need to procure them now to be delivered in the spring of 2020 when they'll be installed, because it's a 1-year lead time for these types of materials, and that work is fully funded. Second thing is we're putting out a competitive bid for the construction of the 2020 work, the installation of those piles. Estimated value $38 million. Bids will be due May of 2019 this year, and that is fully funded. The tough part is competitive bid construction for 2021, which is the balance of the finishing the marine terminal. We need to bid that spring of 2020, effectively a year from now. It's not funded. And along with that, there's some funds for risk management and overall program management of $36 million. So right now we are $116 million short of having the full funding for the PCT. Next slide. Phase 2, we talked about the NES stabilization cutback is the first thing that has to be done. Then we move the port administration functions out of the existing building on Terminal 1, demo the POL 1, and start working our way north, demolishing and building the new Terminal 1 and Terminal 2. Like I said, it's 5 years and 4 separate stages of moving Matson back, moving Matson forward. Same thing with Tote to configure that berth. This phase is 69% of the total program cost. So when we talk about cost savings, value engineering, the biggest bang for the buck is really understanding what's in this phase and figuring out what we can do to get the cost down on this. Next slide. NES1, it's the priority. As I said, it has to be done before we can start Terminal 1 so that Tote can navigate into their berth when we push them back to the north. Right now, the funding source for NES1 is the current MARAD settlement pursuit. Timing of the funding is undefined. So this is going to impact, or potentially could impact, all the dates that are listed in the current plan if the funding is not available when it's needed by the program. Total estimated cost, $121 million. This is very high-risk work. We've got a very high-risk contingency set aside for this. Approximately $50 million of this amount is just the demolition of the sheet pile and removing most of the fill. We've got over 1 million yards of fill to remove and dispose of out into the inlet, back to a point of global stability. So there's a lot of unknowns. It's risky work, and it's very expensive demolition. There is a design requirement was to retain as much of that land as possible because it's leasable space. What we haven't looked at and we can look at is the potential to remove 100% of it, and it may actually be cheaper to not try to retain any of it and demo all of it rather than the cost that it takes to stabilize the material at a certain point. So there's one area that we can look at in terms of the trade-off of losing all of that acreage, but potentially at a lower cost overall. Next slide. Landside buildings, this has to be done before we can start demolishing Terminal 1. It includes the administration building, a new administration building on the port property, relocating a warm storage building that the maintenance guys use, and the site work and utilities. Estimated value $15 million, which is 1% of the total. Right now, the design that the program is developed is about 10%. It's just a rough concept. It's contemplated to be put out as a design build contract, 2021, 2022, and the port would need to vacate their current administration building by the winter of 2022, based on the current schedule. Next slide. All right, these next two slides are by far the biggest piece of this program. So NES1 and Landside Buildings, we said both of those have to be complete before you start Terminal 1. The big catch is we need full funding for Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 before we start Terminal 1, because we can't build out Terminal 1 and then have a delay of multiple years because the wharf line will be 150 feet discontinuous, and that'll cause navigational problems for Tote and Matson. So we can't start Terminal 1 until we have all the funding for both of these terminals. Terminal 2, there's been a lot of talk about, can we just build one terminal? Right now, the plan is based on building Terminals 1 and 2 because Tote and Matson arrive on the same days twice a week. If their schedules were shifted, there's a potential that we could build one terminal and deliver the same. Excuse me. Construction starts on the south end, works to the north over a 5-year period, 4 stages of coordination with Matson and Tote. And it's a very coordination-intensive effort because of the discontinuous wharf face and getting the ships in and out of the slot that's created by moving the new wharf face out 140 feet from the existing wharf face. Design is currently 30% complete, which is typical of phases 2 through 5. The program management team has essentially taken the design requirements and developed a design to the point that we can at least validate that the requirements can be met. The process is when we get ready to design, we retain a designer of record, and they take that concept and they modify it, improve upon it, and develop it to 100%. But we've got a concept developed for Terminals 1 and 2 right now. Design is contemplated for Terminals 1 in 2020 and Terminal 2 in 2022. Contemplation is doing it under one design contract because once you get a design team spun up and they complete Terminal 1, it would be a lower cost to have them do Terminal 2 because it's just more of the same essentially. So contemplating one design contract for all of that work, and then competitively bid 2 separate construction contracts for the 2 separate terminals. Next slide. Terminal 1 is currently pegged at $747 million, 39% of the total program cost. Included in that is Matson-requested requirements of $273 million that are effectively greater than what the current port has right now. Design, again, is scheduled for 2020. Competitively bid the project in 2021, construction 2022 through 2024. Terminal 2, estimated at $448 million, is 23% of the total. Again, design 2022, construction construction bidding out a year before construction starts, so 2024 bid, 2025 through 2026 construction. Next slide. Petroleum and Cement Terminal is $176 million, which is 9% of the total. This project could be accelerated. We can start it right after Terminal 1 if we had the funding. The petroleum terminal design is scheduled for 2024, 2025. All these dates are dependent on the MARAD settlement. If that comes in late, everything starts sliding to the right, or there has to be another funding mechanism to keep on schedule. Next slide. Phase 4 is the remaining part of the North Extension Stabilization. Funding, of course, is linked to the MARAD settlement, and if we got a settlement sufficient, we could accelerate this work and do it tied on with the NES1 piece. We would just basically keep working on down the road, finishing that. Next slide. And then the last phase is T3 demolition. We can leave that terminal in place. This is not a priority project, but eventually it has to be demolished. So this can be put off as long as possible, but eventually it has to be done. Okay, next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about these numbers that we're putting out. We've taken the petroleum and cement terminal cost estimates, and we have 3 independent estimates for each of the design stages. We get one at 35%, 65%, 95%. We've taken the 65% information, and we've said, okay, we're seeing cost increases on the petroleum cement terminal over the original contemplated budget. So what does that mean for the rest of it? And so we took the selective parametric method of estimating. We took major cost drivers, unit costs out of the petroleum and cement terminal, and applied them to those future projects. We did not do a bottoms-up estimate. It just kind of gives us an order of magnitude indication. If we don't do anything different, this is where we're probably going to end up. So the $1.9 billion number, which is the aggregate of all these numbers, it's a number, but you have to understand that the accuracy, we have time to affect the change on the cost. It's just a kind of an order of magnitude indication of where we're heading if we don't do something different. Next slide. So this is the same slide I showed a couple weeks ago. Just added the percentage of the total program cost to the dollar values of each one of these projects. I think it's significant to note that Phase 2, which is the NES Step 1, Landside Buildings, and Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 is 69% of the total. So again, if we want to look at value engineering ideas, look at ways to optimize, go where the biggest dollars are, that's where we got to be looking. Next slide. So I think the big question and why we're here is, how do we deliver modernized facilities with an acceptable schedule and cost? Those are the 2 parameters that we have to meet. With respect to schedule, with the ongoing repair program that the port already does, the existing facilities have an estimated remaining serviceability of approximately 10 years. Could be 9 years, could be 12 years, but based on engineering data, corrosion rates, somewhere in the range of 10 years, and we're going to have to start derating the facilities or abandoning them. The current plan, as I've laid out here, has us finishing the petroleum cement terminal, Terminal 1, 2, and the petroleum terminal by 2027. So the good news is there's time to react, time to get in front of this, optimize, get our costs down to something we can afford, but we don't have a lot of time. We are up against it, and it's time for us to rise to the challenge and figure out a plan here. With respect to cost, evaluation of the major cost drivers. Number 1 is design requirements. Number 2 is the risk, and number 3 is escalation. Reevaluate the design requirements and solutions. And last is leveraging the petroleum and cement terminal project to confirm the cost metrics that we're using. Again, this is kind of an extrapolation of some estimate numbers. As we bid out the work on that petroleum cement terminal, we'll know what the market costs are, and we can forecast more accurately of what these future facilities might cost. Next slide. So I talked about the major cost drivers, one of them being design requirements. So 3 kind of categories of design requirements that we think about: codes and standards, which is the seismic design criteria. I've said that petroleum cement terminal and Terminal 2 are the highest level of criteria allowed by code or defined by code. We've got port-driven criteria like a 75-year design life. And then tenants, we've got tenant operational requirements, and I touched on some of Matson's requirements, and we have ABI requirements and TOTE requirements that are all woven into this. So going back and looking at those requirements in light of where we are with our cost forecast and saying, what can we really afford? Number two is risk contingency. There's $298 million in the current cost estimate for risk. Examples of differing site conditions. The previous program hit a lot of obstructions trying to drive piling. We think that our pile is much bigger and we're using a much bigger hammer, and we feel like we're either going to drive through some of those smaller obstructions or it's kind of a needle in a haystack, we may miss them. But we think that our approach is better addressing the potentiality of differing site conditions, but we have to carry some amount of contingency in case we encounter them. Pile capacity. As much geotechnical information has been conducted on the port, there's still an unknown and there's variation in geotechnical data. So we're going to go out in our first project, we're driving 71 pile, we go back and we load test 10% of them to confirm that they're meeting the design requirements. So there's always a potential of having to drive the piles deeper, and that requires either ordering the piles extra long initially or splicing onto the piles to drive them longer. And there's a trade-off on, do you buy a bunch of piles with extra length that you're not sure you need, or do you order them the right length and then have to splice onto them, and each splice is about $75,000 to $100,000. So it's a big risk to consider. Last one is marine mammal impacts. I cannot underscore the importance of marine mammal impacts. Obviously no way to predict when the beluga whales will swim by, how long they'll hang around the project, how long the contractor might be delayed. We are contemplating spending a lot of money on the petroleum and cement terminal, studying different observation station locations to try to see marine mammals before they come into our area. We're looking at attenuation systems to reduce the hydroacoustics of the footprint that we make, which reduces the zone that we have to monitor. So taking a lot of action on the petroleum cement terminal, which might allow us to better understand and reduce the risk contingency that we carry for these future projects. But right now they're very much unknowns. Last is escalation. We've got $202 million in escalation, and what that means is all of our estimates are based on today's dollars. So we add 3% annually for the years that are contemplated. If funding doesn't come in and the projects slide to the right, that just drives up escalation. If we can get funding earlier, we can pull stuff to the left and reduce escalation. Next slide. So cost driver number one is the design requirements. We intend to conduct a workshop to reevaluate the design requirements with all the stakeholders. That's step number one. In that, there's a trade-off analysis of revised design requirements versus the cost that we're paying for it. Somebody has to make some hard decisions. Revising the current cost estimates based on what the requirements are. So when we revise those requirements, we can go back and look at how much have we affected the overall cost of the program with these revisions to our design requirements. Next one is evaluate alternative solutions to meet the revised requirements for terminals 1, 2, and the petroleum terminal. And that is forward-looking, how do we apply this information? And then the last question is evaluating the merits of revising the petroleum and cement terminal design with the revised design requirements. So we need to look at the trade-off of, do we go back now that we're 100% designed and redesign the petroleum and cement terminal in some fashion? Does the cost of redesign offset the savings that we might achieve by reducing some criteria? We may find that the petroleum and cement terminal meets the revised criteria and there is nothing to change. But it's something we need to consider. Next slide. I talked a little bit about contingency, achieving pile capacity, the encountering obstructions during pile driving, and the delays to marine mammals. Obstacles with demolition of the existing NES sheet pile. On both NES1 and NES2, we have in excess of $20 million of contingency set aside, not understanding or not being able to predict accurately the cost of that demolition. Right now, the plan is to dredge out all of the excess fill that's west of this line of global stability that's been established, which is about 120 feet of that material, dredge it out, it gets disposed offshore, and then we're going down and trenching on either side of the sheet pile wall 10 feet down and shearing it all off. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty in that work. And then the last is unpredictability of commodity volatility. We've seen a 30% increase in steel cost since February of 2017 when federal steel tariffs went into effect. We don't have any idea whether we're at a point of stability on steel pricing, whether it's going to go up higher, whether it's going to drop back, but that's a big concern. Next slide. Escalation, this is the category of time is money. With respect to the schedule, some projects have to be delivered sequentially. We've talked about NES1 has to be cut back before we can do T1, before we can do T2. Some projects can be accelerated if funding was available. We can move NES2 forward and follow NES1 if we had the funding for it. We can do the Petroleum Terminal as soon as Terminal 1 is constructed. So some things we can accelerate, some things we can't. We could design everything in the program so that we have better certainty on cost estimates and stuff like that if we had the money to design everything. Honestly, the biggest problem, of course, is funding. The program started off with $127 million of funding left over from the previous program. In the first 5 years, we're reaching our 5-year anniversary here next week, actually. The first 5 years of the program, we've generated $33 million of additional funding. 31 million of that was generated last month. So in 5 years of fundraising, we've been able to scrape up $33 million. Good news is right now the petroleum and cement terminal is funded fully through the end of 2020, which gets us at least 50% complete on that very critical facility. So we have made a lot of headway. We've got a long ways to go. NES1 and phases 2 through 5 are all essentially tied to the MARAD settlement, if in fact that's our only option for a funding source. Delays in that is going to just push the entire program to the right and increase escalation cost. So Parish Blessing and Associates is supporting the municipality and the port, working on tariff adjustments and those kinds of things. Hilltop Security supports the municipality on the funding pursuits that we've looked at for the last 5 years. And last summer, the municipality engaged Capstan Consulting for a cold eye review of the financing options for the program. Out of that, we need to continue to develop a comprehensive plan of finance strategy that is not just near term, how much do we need to finish the petroleum and cement terminal, but long range so we can take advantage of some of these acceleration opportunities if we can get more funding faster. Next slide. So the actions that the program has identified moving forward. First is reevaluating the design requirements. Having a hard conversation with everybody about what do we really need based on what we can afford. With that, we would evaluate the current solution against the revised design requirements, see how much the $1.9 billion forecasted number is affected by changes in the design requirements. We're here to talk about alternative solutions. They probably based on meeting either the current or revised design criteria. I think that once we've landed on either the current solution or a revised solution, revised criteria, we know where we think we are. It's updating that benefit cost analysis to really agree that, yep, Port of Alaska is the right place to do this. Let's keep moving forward. And then the last one, most importantly, is continuing development of a comprehensive plan of finance strategy. Without money, we can have the best ideas, but whether it's this program is $500 million, $1 billion, pick a number, we've generated $33 million in 5 years, and that's just not going to cut it. So it's going to take all of our collective efforts to figure out a strategy to finance the program. Thank you.
Thank you. That was it? Yep. There might be questions. Anyone?
Questions, sir?
Mr. Trainee?
Is Mr. Falsey here? Would you come and join us, sir? Would appreciate your city manager. I have a few questions. Since most of this relates around money, what we heard, when George Wirtz was mayor, I've been here a while, we had a work session where he says, I've got the solution to the problem, Myrad's going to develop this for us. Well, that's apparently not the case. Bad call on his part. We went with Myrad. Where are we at now without divulging to the public our legal strategy? Where are we at with Myrad?
Top line summary, there were 2 lawsuits that came in the wake of the failed federal project. One was a private party action where the municipality of Anchorage sued all of the private parties who were constructing the project. That was in local federal district court of Alaska. That lawsuit was settled. Our total recovery was about $19 million. We then pivoted to the big dog, which is our ongoing lawsuit against the United States Maritime Administration, or MARAD, that is proceeding in Washington, D.C. in the Court of Federal Claims. We keep trying to set a trial date, and we've obviously also been pursuing mediation and settlements. It keeps slipping, but right now I understand that we are still on the path where we should come to some resolution by the end of this year. I'll have to check in with our legal department to make sure that that is still a firm deadline. I understand that the Department of Justice has been having some turnover in the staff that it has put on the case, and that has led to some additional delays. But we're still hoping that we come to some kind of resolution on the MARAD lawsuit, the pending MARAD lawsuit, by the end of the year.
Could you have a work session with the assembly to let the assembly know exactly where we're at on this? Because I know sometimes you can't tell the public, but as assembly, we'd like to know where we're at on this. If you'd help us with that, sir. The other thing relates to state dollars. We've got a governor that got elected because he wants to put Alaska back to work. The Port of Alaska that's here needs to go to work. So what's our legislative program going down to Juneau this year? Because I've not seen one come in front of us. So my question to you is, when's the assembly going to see the legislative program so we can make sure that if any money comes, the Port of Alaska is the number one for that?
Yeah, on the state program front, since the Berkowitz administration has come into office, the capital request has really been limited to the port of then Anchorage and the port of now Alaska. Precisely because we realize that it is the one need that beats all other needs. So we had put that in our capital request every year and didn't receive a lot of fruit as a result of that request until last year, where we received a $20 million grant with an understanding that there might be another $20 million to come this year. I think with the governor's proposal, we don't know what the status of the promised $20 million to come is. Jason Bockenstead, the mayor's deputy chief of staff, is wrangling the legislative program. I'd have to ask for his assistance to let you know what the timeline on the updated legislative program is. But certainly there are no less than 3 options that the state could help us with. One is they could give us grant money to help us fund this program, which is not a frivolous request, and it is not a moonshot. We are not trying to pioneer in new industries. This is core basic infrastructure that brings about half of all the stuff that comes into Alaska and serves about 85% of our population. They could give us a state grant to help us with all of this, and partly that is further justified by the fact that we are incurring additional costs in this program because we are building a facility that is of statewide seismic robustness, so that if everything else fell down, the whole state could continue to be served by portions of these projects. In the absence of a state grant, there certainly could also be some general obligation bonding. Timing, that becomes difficult because there is no statewide election this year. If they called a special election and did put a general obligation bond on the ballot, that would still be helpful, though, and certainly could help us in the out years. The third is a new thread that we're adding to the conversation, which is one of the things we learned from Capstan Consulting, is that the state could potentially reduce the need for tariff changes by guaranteeing debts. So if we are left to our own devices and have to raise the funding to complete this program on our own, we don't really have the general obligation bonding capacity in the municipality of Anchorage to shoulder a lot of additional costs. But what we could do is raise the tariffs of everything, the cost of everything that's coming over the docks at the port, and then do a short-term borrowing facility that would roll over into revenue bonds. But the financiers are going to want debt service coverage ratios, and so potentially larger debt service coverage ratios, because we won't have demonstrated capabilities and volumes at the tariffs that will be necessary to raise the kind of money that we're talking about. One thing that the state could do is come in and provide a financial guarantee, which is to say, if the revenues that are being generated by the port do not prove sufficient to actually make the debt service payments, the state could then and only then come in to support us. In an ideal world, what that would do is mean that the cost of borrowing went down and the state would actually have to give us nothing. That's a new thread to the conversation. Certainly our preference would be for the state to pick up its share, recognize its stake in the robustness of this facility, but in the absence of actually receiving grant funding, something like a state guarantee would also be of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. It's important this Port of Alaska is viable because, as you said, most of the goods come through here go to the entire state. We need to make sure this port is viable. We're lucky with this earthquake, but if this port doesn't get rehabilitated, it's going to fall apart on its own inertia. Don't want to see that ever happen. Thank you, Mr. Falsey. To the clerk, Barbara, would you get a copy of this presentation today and give it to all the assembly members, please? I would appreciate that.
And also,
because the sheet we have doesn't have the same slides, and I want to get the slides that they gave us today, if you would, please.
I would like to create a special page on the website, and we can start filtering all these documents.
That's all the questions I have now.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. And I would like to note for the record that Mr. Dunbar has joined us. And so, any other questions before we move to the next phase? Hearing none, seeing none. Next, I would like to hear from the folks from Moffett Nickel. Batter's up.
Each other up getting down there.
Good evening. My name's Craig Freese. I'm senior engineer at Moffett & Nickel. We've looked at this as well. I'm sure some of the other consultants here, and I think CH2M went through a lot of the things that we looked at. I guess one of the things that I've observed over the years is that the berth occupancy at the port is relatively low. And, when you talk about Tote and Matson coming in and out on the same days, I guess one question you might ask is why do they have to come in and out on the same days? And would it be possible to share a berth and basically reduce that cost by a considerable amount? And then, there's the question of what about privatizing the port? Is there somebody out there that would be willing to come in and build the port and operate it on a private basis? Or are any of the users willing to participate in the financing of the facility? And then when you look at the two POL terminals, I'm not quite sure why two POL terminals are needed, other than the fact that when the cement ships come in, they lay at the berth for days unloading cement. And so there's a big cost, in my opinion, in the fact that that cement ship ties the berth up for long periods of time. I'm not sure if there's another solution to that problem, but it's probably a $200 million cost. And then finally, the method of contracting could have some bearing on costs. And so I think the contracting strategy needs to be given careful consideration. Do you do this as a hard bid, competitive bid? Do you do it as a CM type contract, a CM/CG type contract, or a design build contract? So those are some things that could potentially affect the cost. I don't think they're going to move the needle a lot, but all of these things tend to add up. And I guess, Cook Inlet is a tough place to build marine structures, possibly one of the toughest in the world. If you look at a cost of a facility, say in Seattle, here we're dealing with almost a 40-foot tide range, strong currents, marine mammals, high earthquake zone. So we're probably near the top of the cost factors when you talk about a facility of this nature. Kodiak recently built a facility, but I don't think there's a good comparison between Kodiak and here because of the soil conditions. The facilities in Kodiak are shallow bedrock, so the pile lengths and the are considerably less. And so, that's the other thing that you have to be careful of when you start comparing other facilities.
So can you do me a favor and describe briefly for the members those various tools of contracting, what they mean? I mean, CM doesn't mean much to me, and I'm
Well,
a contracting person.
competitive bid is a fixed price contract. It's based on a complete design. The CM type approach is where you hire a construction manager to oversee construction. The CMCG is kind of a branch of that where the contractor that's doing the construction management is allowed to self-perform a portion of the work. And the percentage of work it's up to the owner how much of that work he has to bid out and how much he can self-perform. And the design build, well, the work on the North Extension and the South Backlands that Kiewit Manson are doing, that was done under a design build type of contract where the contractor works with an engineer to do the design and the construction. So those are, basically the different type. Now on the CG type contract, you can generally bring the CM on board during the design, and then he can participate in value engineering or design changes to help reduce costs. So normally they're brought on at about 35% level of design.
Thank you. There are other questions. Mr.
Quick
Trainee?
question for him. You mentioned Kodiak. They built a harbor there?
Yeah.
Did they build design sheet rock design sheet, or what did they develop down there? Pilings or what?
Well, I believe that most of the docks in Kodiak are pile supported.
Okay.
And, with the container cranes, generally the crane rail beams, regardless of the type of structure, are going to be pile supported, even on a fill type, sheet pile fill, because of the tremendous loads.
I remember when they brought sheet pile into us that they tried to use it, it wouldn't work. It was all mangled and bent. I'm not sure whether they were dropping rocks on it or trying to drive it through rocks on the ground. I remember seeing sheet pile brought into us, a demonstration, and stuff was just torn apart.
Well, I think that may have been some of the sheets that have been pulled from the existing facility. In the process of trying to remove those sheets, they get quite damaged.
Thank you, sir.
So I think I'll take the opportunity. Any other questions for this gentleman? No, thank you very much.
All right.
And there might be more in a bit, but take this moment to caution that the Municipal Attorney's Office has requested that we keep the topic about future work as much as possible, that we not dive deeply into past litigation with private parties so that we don't create more problems going forward for people. And so we recognize there were challenges in the past. This is a forward-looking effort as much as possible. So that way we don't create more trouble. As long as we don't repeat what we did before, I think we'll be fine. So the next individual or team that I have on my list is R&M, if they're here. R&M, did you make it?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome. Kristen McNeil, I believe. And I just want to thank you all for this. It's already proving enlightening, and I know it's difficult to talk about projects your peers are working on, and so I'm grateful for helping educate the least informed among us.
So R&M is actually a subcontractor working on the design of the current.
Would you say your name for the record
I'm
and
Kim
speak into
Nielsen.
the mic? Thanks.
Kim Nielsen with R&M Consultants. So R&M is a subcontractor working on the design. COE is actually the lead designer for the PCT. So essentially everything that Jeff Boole talked about, we're pretty much in alignment with.
That's all you have?
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Any questions? Okay, next on my list is, I had invited Dell. They said they could come, and then they changed their mind. The next one up is an invitation to P&D.
Thank you. I'm Jim Campbell from B&D, and this is Dempsey Thiemann. He's going to sit here and answer some additional questions if they come up today. I do have a slideshow today. Before I start on that, I think it's important to respond to a couple things that have been said already to date that are really relevant to our presentation. In particular, the presentation by CH2, which is really the core for us, is that the original design done back in 2006 was designed by us and others, reviewed by many, and found a good design and put into construction. The construction went bad, as we all know. And then a subsequent analysis by a different consulting team decided that that design needed to be thrown out and a whole new design process engaged in. And we still maintain to this day that that original design was not flawed. So there's a lot of assumptions about everything that CH2 Jacobs presented today, which, as I go through my presentation, you'll see are really what's causing the problem here. So if we can go to the next slide, this is me and Dempsey. P&D has been working in Alaska for a lot of years. We've worked on all the container ports in Alaska, which is a small number, as you mentioned, Kodiak, Anchorage, Dutch Harbor, 2 in Dutch Harbor. So next slide. It's important to, I think, review for everyone's history here, and I've been intimately involved in the Port of Anchorage since this original project back in 2006, not, of course, in the more recent work with CH2. But the reasoning behind the original design, and this ties into what we would propose as a value engineering solution for where we're at now, so bear with me, is that to start with, the existing port had a lot of salt sedimentation. It was built back in the 40s or whatever when they had smaller ships and they were worried about ice and they wanted to be closer to shore. But with modern construction and all the situation, what we have now, we actually want to be out in deeper water. It will significantly reduce dredging needs in the future. It's kind of a self-cleaning design. So that was the basis of what we're doing at what's labeled as NE up here for the North Extension. It also created valuable uplands. And importantly, it would avoid conflicts with all these existing terminals while you're doing the new construction. So you can continue to use the existing facilities and you don't have all this problem with sequencing that we're facing with the current design. There are some other benefits as well, the deeper draft and mitigating sediment problems with the existing docks, but that's really the crux of it. So now if we go to the next slide. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the North Extension area, which the current proposals are talking about essentially wiping this out. And for a reason that we actually continue to disagree with technically. This is actually one of the best areas of the port. It's really seismically stable and strong. So there's no reason to demolish that. The original design was sound. It was messed up during construction. They damaged a bunch of stuff, and as Councilmember Charrette said, the sheets, when you pull them out of the ground, they looked ugly. But this option, what it does for you is it allows you to avoid the sequencing problems of the current construction, which the number one need is a new terminal for Terminal 1. But in order to build Terminal 1 under their plan, you have to first move one of the petroleum docks. So you build a whole new petroleum dock before you can even start to do the terminal. Then you start demolishing stuff. You have to demolish buildings and move buildings and demolish the existing petroleum dock. So all that sequencing is just so you can get the new terminal for Matson. There's an existing piece of land that was just built for that, right here at the North Extension. So taking what you've got there, and instead of throwing it out, if you actually just figure out how do we address the problems from before and build something there, it's a big cost savings. So if we go to the next slide. So here's just a cross section. I apologize, there's actually some colors in this, But on these green screens, they don't really show up. There's water and land and everything else. But if you just kind of imagine, you can see them. Oh, they show up better back there. But essentially, if you take the existing sheet pile wall that's there, it was originally designed to be a full berth height. And the ships were going to dock right against the sheet pile. But there's a lot of damage there. We've studied it and we know what's there. And if you instead built a marginal wharf in front of it, which is similar to what's in Kodiak, there are different soils, but actually the soils at Port of Anchorage get so hard, they're almost as good as bedrock. So it's not that different than Kodiak. But by building a marginal wharf there, you keep the sheet pile wall. You actually reduce the effective height of the wall by putting a cross-section of fill in front of it, building the dock. And this is a really efficient solution. This is actually what's at Kodiak. Kodiak has an open cell sheet pile back wall, just like what's shown here. Next slide. So we actually, I found this in our files. This is a slide from 2012 that we never got to present to the assembly because we were being sued. So, but we were trying to solve the problem even back then. It was a good idea. So following from the previous slide, we just showed a Matson dock. You could build a second berth for tote. This is a lower cost alternative that instead of having a continuous full dock, you just have the access trestles where you need them for the ramp locations. That's actually what Tote has at their existing Tacoma port facility. Saves $50 million right there, if you want to do that. So next slide. Or you could do a full dock, which is kind of similar to the Terminal 2 idea that is currently in the current plan. But this adds cost. So next. Just commented, Pier 3 at Kodiak, which was just completed. P&D designed that. It does have a sheet pile bulkhead wall, pile-supported wharf in front of it, 100-foot gauge crane, the same Matson ship that calls in the Port of Anchorage, calls it Kodiak. They do a circle. It's only 420 feet of face for an 800-foot vessel, but that project was only $35 million. So, we'd love to be in that order of magnitude here. Next. Unalaska Marine Center, one of the 2 container docks out at Dutch Harbor. Dempsey designed that, just completed for $35 million, and that includes, all the 700 feet of new dock, crane rails, utilities, fenders, everything. And it's very high seismic out there, just like Port of Anchorage. So, next. So here's the breakdown of costs. So this is really the nut of it. So the first column there are the costs that we just saw earlier here today. In order to build their Terminal 1, which is item number 4 on this list, they have to start out with, or the city has to start out with this PCT dock, which is $240 million. Then they have to move buildings, and then they start demolishing this North Extension fill. All so they can get down to item number 4, which is the new Terminal 1. We bypass all that. We can go straight to just building Terminal 1. It's right there. The land's available, and it's the obvious choice. We did a bottoms-up cost estimate for that, which, if for those in the industry means, that's really like an engineering quality estimate. We estimated the jobs in Kodiak and Dutch Harbor, and we were very close. So we're pretty confident in these numbers. They include 20% of contingency and 18% engineering and permitting. So they're probably a little fat. But you can see if you just build the North Terminal, it's $186 million. There's your order of magnitude. That's about a tenth of the $1.9 billion. That's if you just did a single terminal, and someone did mention earlier, and it's really a valid idea. Could Matson and Tote use the same terminal? From an engineering perspective, the answer is absolutely yes. There are commercial reasons and other things that could go into it, and they might be mad at me for saying that, but that's the fact. If you wanted to go ahead and do the second terminal, what we showed were just the access trestles, that's $64 million. If you did the full wharf with continuous access at the second berth, that's $115 million. So you can see there's substantial savings to be made there, and but you have to go back and question the fundamental assumptions. And the municipal attorney is probably gritting his teeth right now, just hearing me say this stuff. But it's a fact, and as a lifelong Alaskan, I have a lot of concerns about this project, and it pains me to see the project killed with these just crazy costs. So I didn't.
Mr. Chairman.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we don't have a button, so we can't ask.
Yep.
So I've looked through the rest of this presentation, and there's really good stuff in there, but I think the main issue is what he's already said. I mean, I want to ask a question if that's all right now.
So, under the advice of the municipal attorney, they suggested that we table that part of this hearing and come back to that when we've thought through how we're going to do that.
Okay.
I guess maybe I wasn't clear. I don't want to ask him about prior litigation. I want to ask him about,
Okay.
why isn't, can we ask him any questions
I
at
will
all?
allow it, and I'll just walk a fine line here, and if my phone starts blowing up, I will bang the gavel.
Yeah, and I apologize. I was late to the hearing, so I apologize that this has already come up. But this is fascinating to me that there's someone who is proposing using the thing that we have been hearing for years needs to be torn up. And so I guess I have a couple questions. First is, are you aware of, we've been shown drone footage that shows significant cracks in this land following the earthquake. Are you aware of that damage?
Yes.
And why hasn't the Port Commission locked onto this? I mean, this is 1/10 what we're thinking about paying. So why are you the only one who seems to believe this is technically possible?
Well, I don't know if I'm the only one that thinks it's technically. I know my entire company thinks it's technically possible. I know geoengineers thinks it's technically possible. Terracon thinks it's technically possible. West Construction thinks it's technically possible. But I can't speak for others. But regarding why this hasn't come up before, it's simply that when things are in a lawsuit, everyone has a gag order. So we haven't been offered a chance to speak to you, and we haven't been offered a chance to defend the original design.
But presumably you've had the opportunity to speak directly with the people that actually manage the port, with our port team and with the Port Commission. What has their reception been like?
Who are you speaking about?
We are we are the Anchorage Assembly, and we are technically like the board of directors for this and for many other things in the municipality, but usually we have highly skilled professional managers, and I think we have that kind of team at the port right now. Have they been receptive to this?
I don't think so. I think that it's been largely kind of a bandwagon towards a new design. And it's important to go back to the original premise that I made, which is we did that design. It had a lot of review and scrutiny at the time. I mean, it really got a lot of questions and a lot of people asking, is this valid? It was approved and went to construction, and it was damaged during construction. That doesn't mean the design was bad. It means it was constructed poorly, and it never finished. Then someone else said, no, that design's no good. But so you have two teams saying the design, one says it's good, one says not. Who's right? That's never been resolved. And I think that given where these costs are going, that you'd really be well served to take a hard look at that, because our company's done a lot of ports around Alaska, and they're not all failing. We have a lot of experience, and the people that said that design was faulty in the first place got a redesign contract. So,
All right, so I'm going to pull this in and say that
Could I add one more piece of information?
briefly.
There's a National Science Foundation study that was done on the Bootlegger Cove, on the global stability of these materials here, just recently done in the last 4 months completed. There was a presentation to the GAC, the Geotechnical Advisory Committee, and the basis or the results of that study were that this area is seismically stable. There is no reason to remove all of this, the earth and the sheet pile. It is seismically stable.
So I think that because we are in active litigation with MARAD, that I think the better course of action would be to plan for, if the administration and the parties are amenable, and have a special meeting with an executive session to talk about legislative or legal action. Because I feel like we're over the line a little bit toward an actual current legal action. And so if there's no super burning questions from the membership, I'd like us to consider coming back to this.
Question for him. It's not too controversial, I promise.
Catbird smile.
I remember when your project came to us originally,
Mr.
you
Craney.
had bigger cranes being put in there. If I remember correctly, the cranes were going to come here because we hadn't developed the port. It actually went to Vietnam or someplace in South in that part of the world. They had some huge cranes that these ships needed that we just couldn't put them up here. Do you remember that time frame?
are we talking about the cranes that were going to come to the port expansion project?
Yeah, the big ones.
I think that one of them was actually repurposed is the Kodiak, because those were purchased by Horizon.
Because I remember they were giving us a time frame. If we wanted to do this, we had to have it to do this level to get the cranes put in. And now we've got to go through the process of reordering those cranes to get them up here.
Yeah.
So
There's a long lead on those.
anyway, thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. And I look forward to a more interesting conversation as time goes
Thank you.
on.
I'm sorry if I stepped across the lines.
It's, we just have to protect the interests of the municipality and ensure that the ratepayers and taxpayers are getting a fair deal. And so you brought up geotechnical, and so now, since everyone that I have on my list has come up and spoken, I want to lay out a handful of meetings that are brewing for the next several weeks, maybe a couple of months. A discussion with the port customers and what they need out of the Port of Alaska, so that we ensure that we're not just hearing from engineers who work great in the abstract, but the people who actually do the work and live and work out there. Then a conversation with the geotechnical professionals in the community, so we can get a better sense of what's actually going out in the port. And then we'll follow up, I believe, and I haven't spoken with Mr. Falsey about this, but I think there are rumors of this, that it might be wise at some time in the not too distant future to have a joint meeting with the Port Commission to have a discussion about their perspective on this. And so that lays out a work plan for this committee over the next few months. I actually have a slate of questions. If I had a panel of people up here, I would have asked questions and let you all field them. But instead, what I'm going to do is formulate them into an email and ask for folks to respond to them at their leisure and if they're interested, because I understand there are some people that aren't interested in talking. And that's interesting. And so with that, I would open up to questions, the body.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Wimhoff.
Yeah. Actually, could we ask people if they could come up and you could ask those questions, or at least a few of them?
I think that maybe it's better to do it more thoughtfully because of the legal perils.
Okay.
And so I think that that's a better move, to think it through and not just use this pulpit to put too much out there. However, we do have now on our agenda, if there's no other comment, hearing none, audience participation. And so the chair of the assembly, Mr. Croft, decided this room was the proper venue for this conversation because the people of Anchorage need to hear this and need to see that we're taking this seriously. And so we are now opening the gavel for audience participation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Paul Foos. Lived on 11th and Cordova, lived in Anchorage for about 65 years. And I want to thank you for this, because this is one of the most important projects in the state of Alaska. And what you've got here is what you've inherited. None of you had any to do with this. This is all previous administrations that got us where we are today, but you're the ones that have to figure out what to do about it. So I want to say that I'm just speaking as a citizen here today, although I do want to say in the past that I have worked for and with Tote, Matson, Moffett Nickel, P&D, the Southwest Marine Pilots, and actually for the Port of Anchorage. I did the distribution study that shows how the cargo goes to the whole rest of the state. So I've also participated in just about every major port project in the state of Alaska, whether it was as mayor of Dutch Harbor, city manager of Nome, commissioner of commerce and economic development, chairman of the ADA board, and chairman of the state bond bank. So I'm just saying that why I feel qualified to say something about this project. So I also have read all 1,700 pages of the CH2M Hill report on it, and I also filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the port for all the documents, including all the backup and engineering reports that they currently have, and I've read all of those. Also, most importantly to your work here, I attended your Geotechnical Advisory Committee meeting about 2 months ago that heard a report from Dr. Richard Fino, and he is a professor at Northwest University. He's on contract with the National Science Foundation to do a really independent and unbiased analysis of the soils at the Port of Anchorage. I'd highly recommend that you ask him to come speak to you. What he presented at the Geotechnical Advisory Committee was completely different than the analysis that we received that called the original design into question. Completely different. And that's a National Science Foundation funded analysis, so I'd suggest that. And so here in just a couple minutes, I can just tell you kind of how we got there. And first was, when the project was first put out, there was a bid protest because the method of construction was a company that never ever done a project before like this. The method of construction was called into question, and the bid protest was filed, but yet it went through. Well, everything that was predicted in that bid protest happened. Then, the main differences, and I'll tell you why, difference between building it from the land or building it from the water side in a barge. So from the land, they said, look, the vibration, all the fill is going to go out. Well, that's what it did. So what was the answer? Well, we'll put huge boulders at the bottom of it to try to hold the fill in, and we're going to try to drive sheet pile through those huge boulders. You don't even have to be an engineer to understand that that's not going to work. So then once that all failed, then the idea was, well, let's get, an analysis of this. And then an analysis was done. But, from that, generally when you're doing...
Hold on, Paul. Mr. Foos?
Yes.
Mr. Train.
Anything else you wanted to say, Paul?
What's that?
Keep going, Paul. Paul, anything else you've got to say? Keep going. I've known you for years. I respect your opinion. Keep telling us what's going on, okay?
Your time had expired, and he's asking you a question.
I will. And so usually when you do out there and you have an analysis done, you say, look, you can't do follow-on work after that. You can't say, if you find a problem, I'm going to give you these big contracts to do additional work. So in any case, that was just another way that we got here. So the other thing, that once you accepted that original analysis, now you're really screwed up, because now I can't build the port where it is. Now I've got to build the container, the cement and container pipeline terminal, because now I'm going to be interfering with the existing operations. Now I'm going to use all the money for that. I don't have a penny to build the container terminals. And in the meantime, I'm going to spend $250 million removing land at the port. I've never heard of a port anywhere in the world that would pay $250 million to remove the land from the port. Why would you ever do that? If you build what was put on the table here, you can keep your existing docks. They're not going to be good for heavy loads with big cranes, but that's your cruise ship dock. Why would you why would you destroy the existing dock? That's where barges come to fill in and fill up with fuel to take out to Western Alaska. We're destroying more than we're building. I really appreciate you guys, taking a look at this. And I can tell you just in Juneau, I go back and forth. The way what's being presented right now has zero credibility in the legislature or with the administration. So I think, somebody needs to grab a hold of this, come to a, rational, cost-effective solution for this. and do it. It probably will require a bit of a tariff change, but, if you did, at 300 million, you've got 130. If you did an $85 million bond and the state matched it, you could build your container terminals. That's what you just saw. So in any case, I know that you need to do a lot of due diligence in looking at this, but, the idea of both combining the two facilities, and having to not build two, but one, if they could just come on a different day. I don't know what it would take to negotiate that, but you're double building what you need just by that. We're only using the port 27% of the time because of that. So I take any questions that you might have, but that's what it looks like to me. And I've worked on almost every major port project in the state of Alaska for the last 30 years.
Thank you, Paul. Good to see you again. I'm done.
No further question. Anyone else?
Hi. Nobody has ever hired me to be a public speaker, so I'm going to try to keep this short. But
what's your name?
My name's Stephen Fisher. I was a resident engineer. I'm a structural engineer that I was hired as a resident engineer at the port. I was there from about September 2017 to this November 2018. I just want to address your short-term issues right now, which is CH2 presented an idea, I guess, or that they would have a separate pile procurement, and then a month or so later have a bid for the rest of the work. And I just wanted to, I think that you'll be able to save probably $5+ million by just putting that package together, because in my experience in dealing with, I believe that they would probably have gone with a CMAR process, which is there's minimal negotiation. They just take whatever price they get. But they will have excluded many bidders. So opening up the material procurement opens it up to a much broader spectrum of mills and suppliers and fabricators. And over the year that I was there, I think we probably spent at least $20 million more than we should have that cost the municipality of Anchorage, just because of poor procurement and poor management of design, ongoing designs and whatnot. And I'd love to share that information with you all if I can get emails or whatever. But I just want to keep this with your short-term concerns, which is basically keep those two together, because separating the pile procurement, there's a lot of logistics that go along with that a contractor can get efficiencies with fabrication and shipping, and going straight to, you'll have storage problems, owner-supplied materials with a future contract, and there's probably no real reason to do that separately anyway, because as they pointed out, they haven't finished design. It won't be done till March 15th, and so you're not going to get a real pile procurement price until after March 15th anyway. They're talking about getting prices on the actual work for putting those piles in a month after that. There are parts of that design that include the fender piles that are fabricated pieces that contractors may have different innovative solutions, or they want to incorporate it or not incorporate it to the field. So I think you want to give that opportunity to the contractors. I think you'll save $5 million just on that one portion. And if you got any questions.
Mr. Trainee.
You said you got comments you'd like to send to Assembly.
Yeah.
Go to media.org. You've been out there. You were part of the city for a while. And just send them to Barbara, city clerk.
Okay.
She'll make distribution to all Assembly members.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Other members of the public?
Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Zins. I'm with ABI, the cement terminal. We are in agreement something needs to be done with the port. We have no issues with that. The issues that we have is it seems like we just received a cost, and now we're rushing to push a tariff through. And a tariff at an escalated price is significant escalation. So we just had electrical increase this year of roughly 500% in 1 year on one of our electrical rates from ML&P. And to put out a tariff in advance of an actual construction cost sends a message to the industry that says, here's what it's going to be. It may not end up at that tariff rate, but the potential to get there is what industry is going to look at. So if industry sees the potential worst case scenario of 500% increase in 5 years, we're going to look at that number and go from there. And Fuel can talk more to this. They have a larger volume than we do, but that's what we're looking at. So what I would propose is instead of rushing through the tariff process, we take a hard look at the construction design and see, is this $200 million for this first tariff phase something realistic? Is that a real number? And I hear a lot of differing opinions here, and I'm not an engineer. We have an advisor here that can speak more to that. But as far as an industry, if we look at just increase after increase after increase, it's a dock that we can't afford. And just to say you're going to push that along to a customer, everything's going to go up as a result of that. I mean, these are significant price escalations. And has the diligence been done after we found that construction cost to set tariffs already? And I understand we need money, and tariffs increase, something's going to have to happen. But is this a dock that we can afford? And that's our issue. And we can set up here at the panel if you have questions, but we also have an advisor here that can talk about the engineering as well.
Any questions? So I do, if no one else does. So what's your role in ABI?
I'm the Vice President General Manager.
So then you would probably have an understanding of what happens to customers if the first wave of the tariff goes through, right? Because really we're talking not just one tariff increase. If we're talking about building this whole project, we're talking about at least, I should say that cycles of increases, right? So one cycle of increase for the cement port terminal, and then a whole other cycle of increases for all the other goods for Tote and Matson to get in.
Correct.
So what happens to those costs?
Well, how much can you pass on? Mm-hmm. So you pass those prices on to your customer. You get to a point to where your customers decide to do something else.
What would that look like?
Other ways to bring in material.
Like?
Are you going to bring in fuel from different areas? Is it going to come across the port? Are you going to rail in product? Are you going to bring product into different areas? Are you going to come up with different ways to avoid tariffs and escalated prices?
A lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's the issue that we have is if we start with a tariff process and we say we're going to phase it in, I see where year one is now, but my planning from a business standpoint is worst case scenario. So just knowing how construction projects go and past practices or past history of other projects is, as a business, I'm not going to place reliance on, hopefully this thing doesn't happen. I'm going to look at that and say this is our worst case scenario. So what other options do we have? And maybe we get halfway through that phase and that's not the worst case scenario. Well, I may have already started processes down that line to do another alternative.
Right, so we are going to have a meeting with port customers, so we're kind of running down a channel that isn't really germane to the agenda tonight.
Sure.
Although this is public, so you can speak on what you want, but we will have you back if you want to come back.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? No. Okay, thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening, I'm Jim Ferguson. I was project manager for ABI on the Dome project that was recently completed on schedule and on budget at the port. I have been retained by ABI to do a constructability review of what you're referring to as the Petroleum Cement Terminal dock. So I'm only looking at one small portion of this. I'm not looking at scheduling or all these global issues. I'm looking at one small portion from a constructability. I have been active in the Alaska construction market since 1984, and have built a number of buildings up here, structures. My first concern is your 12-foot diameter piling that you have under the dolphins on that project. Most of the piling on that project are 48-inch diameter piling, hollow steel pipe. This is readily available material. You have got 9 super piles, monopiles underneath the dolphins and the breasting buoys that are 12 foot in diameter. This is a total game change. We have roughly 70 piling that are all one size, and for 9 piling we go to this super pile, and right now there are at least 2 hammers in Alaska that can drive 48-inch cans. There are about a dozen cranes in Alaska that can drive a 48-inch can. We have not identified a hammer on the West Coast that could drive a 12-foot can. So we're asking a contractor at some point in time to bring in a special hammer and a special crane just to drive 9 piles. My suggestion there would be to give the contractor an option. Give us the option to go to 48-inch piles or 12-foot diameter and let the contractor decide what's the most economical. I got a $100 bill in my pocket, and I'll bet any of you or all of you the price that will come in, the 48-inch pile, is much cheaper to build. It will help your schedule. If I've got 2 cranes working and I need a 3rd crane, it's available in the state, I can bring it in. If I have to bring a great big crane off the West Coast, it's probably $250,000 to bring that crane in to drive 9 piles. So I would get rid of the 12-foot diameter piles and go to 48-inch piles. There are catwalks accessing these dolphins and these where they tie the boat up to. These are basically super long, 4-foot wide catwalks, like 100 feet long to get from buoy to buoy. Unfortunately, we've got catwalks on this project that vary in length of 77 feet to 166 feet with no symmetry of that. There's no continuity. We have 9 separate catwalks that take 9 separate calculations, drawings. In the shop drawings on one of those catwalks is probably 1.5 inches of paper. Come on, let's move them a little bit, make them all the same size, and it will make it a lot easier.
Mr. Trainee.
Jim, in a couple of minutes, can you finish up your comments to us?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I've worked on that port and that port project for a number of years. You have a water line going from a fire hydrant owned by ABI to the dock. I've dug through that area, and that area is full of debris left over from the 1964 earthquake. Almost everything from downtown Anchorage got pushed down to that part of the dock, and we've dug through it for a great cost. I would plead with you to consider putting that water line in a utilidor and not bury it 10 feet deep, but bury it maybe 3 foot deep, and it will save you a couple years' wages right there on that. We dug through purses from Nordstrom's that came out of the 64 earthquake on that. Your pile caps, right now you're showing us precast. They're awful heavy. They're awfully complex. I would like to see an option for structural steel pile caps. They would help as your template to drive your piles, and they will save you a lot of money. I'm going to back up to what Mr. Zenz was talking about a minute ago. You know, one option that I'm afraid of is if these tariffs go through, we will have people go to the no-build option. We have trouble with low-income housing. We have trouble with housing costs. We have trouble with cost up here. If the costs go up, I can tell you what, there will be projects that aren't built, and that's a scary aspect of it. One final point, I would plead with the city to consider or adopt a dispute review board for this project. I've worked on over 15 dispute review boards up here. The Performing Arts Center that I built had a dispute review board. Goose Creek Prison had a dispute review board. The school district had, 6 or 8 different projects. Good and honorable people can disagree, and you need to have a mechanism to resolve those disputes quickly. You've got the railroad, you've got the port, you've got the city, you got the Corps of Engineers, and a whole litany of other people. Chances are that you're going to have some disputes, and you need to have a reasonable, quick way to do it. And going forward, I would ask that you make sure you have a dispute review board in these documents to help do that.
All right. Any further questions? Mr. Croft.
So have you given some estimate of what those changes you're recommending would be in terms of cost savings?
I haven't had access yet to the budget. I've asked for it, or the estimate, so I can't really ask it. That first one, I would guess, is in the millions. Okay? That going from the 12-foot diameter cans that weigh 3,000 pounds a foot to something that weighs 300 pounds a foot. And I find it interesting that they're choosing to buy the 48-inch cans, which are extremely readily available, and I don't see up there the procurement of the 12-foot diameter cans, which are, if there may not be 2 sources with the domestic steel for those cans right now. They're a special breed. 48-inch cans we can bring up on the railroad, we can bring up on trucks, we can bring up on barges through Seward. 12-foot diameter cans, we got to bring them up by barge into Anchorage. And it really limits our ability. And so that's a bad idea, and it's got to be thrown out.
Yeah, thank you. If you get us your comments in writing, that would help me parse through them. And also, if there's information that you need to get some rough estimate of the cost savings of what you're talking about and that you're not getting, you could also let us know by email.
I'm certain it will come to me. These requests, there's a lot of entities.
Okay. Well, if you get stalled, let us know.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
but I expect to get
I would reiterate what Mr. Croft said. Please submit your comments to us in writing.
Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else? Members of the public care to speak on this item? Not an item, but this work session. Yeah.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in the Matson Valley. Follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. First, I'd like to compliment the Assembly for holding the meeting here, and it would also be nice to send them in constant training, listen to the public when they're speaking instead of talking among themselves. So, as I said before, your meetings have when you're meeting outside of here, a lot of information. But when you hold the meeting like you did here for this item, you're connecting with the public. They may not have been able to be here, but look, they can clearly listen to the tapes, video, audio, and hear what transpired. And also look at the attendance. Can you get these numbers in those other rooms? Not really. So, and look what time of day it is, but look at also the subject. On this issue, I noticed was a call for privatization of the port. I'm hearing that out in the valley too. I strongly caution you in that move, not to go and deal with privatization and keep control by the city. We're all running in a scenario of a questionable budget in the future and what the state is going to be connecting with rebuilding, but don't go in the direction of privatization. I realize the port has had some issues, in going forward, but privatization is not the answer. And the last part of what I will address is the scenario, and it would be great to have Assembly members pay attention to what the public say, but I guess Assemblymember Croft and Constant want to engage conversation outside the attention of the public. So what I want to say is this meeting, we had an earthquake, yes, centered in the valley. It had an impact to this port. I heard nothing in relationship to the impact and the cost of what happened to the port. And it's like business as usual. You're proceeding, you're hearing costs, but what has been said to guarantee the future of the investment of this city for the port, to assure that it can withstand the future earthquakes, and remind you that earthquake that happened recently in November was nothing to the one that happened in '64. So I caution you with the investment dollars that you're looking into and trying to figure out where you're going to come up with the funds. You need to be a lot more wiser in how you put those dollars, and you need to be sure that it's not throwing money in a scenario and saying, well, we guess we should have penciled in the issue about seismic risk in high-risk areas. And I would also like to remind you this, the last point, this is all to say, is remind you that the '64 earthquake and how communities moved away from where they were in the Kenai Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Public comments on this topic or any topic? Nope, hearing none, then we'll move to the next section of the agenda. Mr. Croft?
Yeah, I simply want, I'm not sure what the next section is, but announcement or audience.
Well, it would be adjournment, but you can go.
Thank you. Whatever section we're under. We have been working, Mr. Constant and I, as chairman of this committee, on a proposal to the Assembly on whether we hire a consultant to help us understand some of these issues. Similar to what we did with SAP, working with the administration, but having our own expertise so that we can make some of these decisions more informed. So we'll be bringing that before you. You don't want to spend extra money, but you also want to be able to understand technical areas that are beyond most of our expertise. And also consulting with the administration on further meetings and with you, Mr. Chairman, and then that executive session discussion I want to have an understanding. We like to do as much as we can in the public, yeah. But if there's litigation and other reasons where we have to step back and have those conversations in a way so we can understand the issues and see if they're there without disturbing ongoing litigation, we'll look at those.
Thank you. Any other comments? Anything? Nope. Hearing none. Then let's, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.